Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Kris. This is part 2. This found footage will haunt your dreams. Before we get started, bare minimum, if you can click that thumbs up, helps me out tremendously. Huh? Tried to tame Dennis Rodman though. Anyways, bare minimum, if you click that, subscribe to the channel if you like the content. Click on the thanks button if you want to keep the channel rolling. All right, this is going to be a shorter video. I think it's like 20. Yeah, right there. Nothing I can do about it. I hate breaking it up in the middle of it. People get mad. They get mad at anything I do, really. So you just got to take it. Here we go.
Our Prime membership includes Amazon Music absolutely free. So if you're ready to dive deeper into strange, dark, and mysterious podcasts, on May 28, 2022, a photographer named April Vertucci, along with 2 of her friends, snuck towards this abandoned funeral home in Flint, Michigan. The funeral home was a big brick building right off a main road in the center of the city, and April and her 2 friends knew there were lots of people that were kind of looking in this direction, and it was illegal to go into this property, and so very carefully they snuck their way towards the back door of the building, and they saw the door was, completely attached to its hinges. It was in good shape, appeared to be locked, but they thought, what the heck? They walked up to the door, took a look around. April reached down, tried the handle, and it pulled right open. And as soon as this happened, April was psyched. Because not only was she a photographer, but she was also an urban explorer, which meant she would sneak into places like this, abandoned buildings and other man-made sites, just to have a look around. One, because it was fun and exciting, but also because she got to use her photography, taking cool.
I always get in trouble whenever I try to do it. Because you go exploring and the police are always called. And I don't know if it's because I always pick banks and try to go into the vaults, but whatever it is, it's flat out disrespectful. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Maybe it's the ski mask I'm wearing and the threats of violence if they don't give me the money. I don't know. Whatever it is, it's stupid.
Pictures of places like this funeral home. And so April's friends were also into urban exploring, and as soon as this door came open, it was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe we're gonna get to explore this legendary site. So this funeral home had been shut down about 5 years earlier because of reports of unsanitary conditions inside. Anonymous reporters had gone in and discovered that there were literally like human remains out. There were up to 40 bodies being stored in one room with no air conditioning, so they're just rotting. There's maggots all over the place. There's embalming liquids on the ground. There's blood everywhere. I mean, basically, this place was like the site of a horror movie. And so the state comes in, they shut this place down, and the owner, after being shut down, just abandons the building, just leaves it exactly the way they had left it. I mean, the bodies were removed by the state, but all the equipment for the funeral home was just left behind. Everything was sealed up, and that was that. And the place was deemed off limits. But naturally, urban explorers found out about this and began going in to see this horror show for themselves. And so April and her friends, they had heard about this place and immediately were like, we gotta go in there, we gotta see it for ourselves. And so they hopped in a car and they drove over 3 hours from Ohio to Michigan just to check this place out. And now here they were, door open, and in they go. Once the door shut behind them, April and her 2 friends were looking down this long, dark hallway. It's totally silent inside. The walls were made out of cinder block that had been painted white, but the paint was all chipping off, and they had their flashlights out, and it's dark and creepy, and they're looking down the hallway, and just for a second, they just stop and listen to see if anybody else is inside of here moving around. Maybe other urban explorers or even other animals or anything, squatters, they don't know, but they're sitting there for a second just listening, and they don't hear anything. And so with April in front, they begin walking down this hallway. And as they're walking, there's all this trash on the ground. It's totally eerie as they're walking. Every little sound is sort of startling them. They're kind of laughing as they're going. And eventually, April stops in front of this first door that she sees, the first door off the hallway, and it's closed. And right across the center of this door is this big caution sign saying, stay back. And then underneath the caution sign, it says formaldehyde. And so April and her friends knew that, okay, well, formaldehyde is a chemical used to embalm bodies, something funeral homes did. And so they know that behind this door very likely was the embalming room, where funeral homes would literally pump dead bodies full of formaldehyde and prep the bodies, to be presented at the wake, before they're actually laid to rest. It's like this is where actual dead bodies are manipulated. And so April and her friends are pretty excited. And so April's, she opens up the door and they look inside of this room and it's very eerie. It's pretty much vacant. But in the center of this room, it's all dark. They have their flashlights, right? In the center of the room is this metal table, this standalone metal table. It's like a gurney. And it's where the dead body would be placed as they're being embalmed. And then on the walls all around are all these shelves with various tools and, vials of various milky liquids. There's a saw, there's scissors, there's scalpels. On the ground, there's, fabric that appears to have some sort of bodily fluids on it. I mean, this really looks like the scene of a horror movie. But for April and her friends, it's like, this is a gold mine. I mean, this is what we came here for. And so April and her friends, for the next little bit, they just began walking all around the embalming room. April taking photos and her friends and April kind of moving things around, seeing what was in there. And then eventually, they left and they continued to search the building and they found a chapel where there were caskets laying around. They also went into a garage and they found there was an old hearse just left inside the garage. I mean, the place really was as creepy as everybody said it was. And so it was sometime around discovering the garage that the girls had gone back to the main hallway and they discovered this other door that they hadn't seen when they were searching over the first 30 minutes they had been in there. And this door led to this ominous stairwell that went down into what appeared to be the basement. And so at this point, the girls felt like they had sort of searched the entire main floor. And, the two friends, not April, they really wanted to go down these steps and explore the basement. They'd been here long enough that it seemed pretty clear that they were the only ones there. It had been totally quiet. And even though it was creepy, ultimately, they sort of felt safe at this point.
You figure they would have done something with the car. Even if you're going to take it. Sell it at an auction or something like that. But the material, the containers of formaldehyde and all that stuff you saw when they walked in to the room. I think I'm going to go right over it, I'm sure. But you would think that would not be allowed to remain in there. I don't know, it doesn't seem sanitary. And if you're not going to do, what do you do with that building? If you're not going to do anything with the building, knock it down. I don't know. I'm very uncomfortable right now with them going into the basement. Urban exploring sounds so fun, and I would love to do it, but I would be the guy who would bring a gun and a knife, and then they'd be like, yeah, a bunch of people went urban exploring, and one guy murdered 9 other people because he heard a cricket suddenly started going, and he just started shooting randomly and screaming while he shit his pants. If you ever hear that in the news, that's probably me.
And April did too, but she also was having a great time still taking pictures on the first floor. And so at this point, the group decided to split up. The two friends would go down into the basement, and April, for a little bit longer, would stay up on the first floor and just continue taking photos, and then she would join them. And so, no big deal, they split up, the girls go down to the basement.
Haven't we seen this play out in horror movies? The split up? Yeah. You agree? That's typically what happens, isn't it? You're whining because you know that it's not good. You're also stupid. So, yeah, you're dumb. Yep. Getting excited because you're stupid. Yep.
April's taking her photos, doing her thing, and just a couple of minutes later, April hears her friends in the basement, through the floors, yelling out something to the effect of, "Oh my gosh, is that real?" And then the other friend is like, "Yes, that is real, oh my gosh." And so April, she runs to that doorway, she goes down the stairs, and she finds her friends at the foot of the stairs. And they're looking out into the main space of the basement that April can't quite see yet. And so she goes right down to her friends, she's looking at them. They look horrified, they're looking out at something obviously terrible in the basement. And April turns from her friends to the basement, and what she sees makes no sense. There's just like this empty basement, with some stuff pushed up against the walls, but in the middle of the basement is what appears to be like this standalone metal jail cell. Like imagine metal rungs that you would imagine in a jail, but all the way around. It's about 8 feet tall, 10 feet wide, 4 feet deep. It's just this inexplicable standalone jail cell. At least
That's where they kept the zombies. Has to be.
That's the way April interpreted it, and so did her friends. And as she's looking at it, April, she sees that in the middle of the jail cell, if you will, is like this big metal box that's just sitting on the floor.
It's Dracula.
In the center of the cell, and then right above it, in the ceiling, is this pretty big cutout, like a hole in the ceiling. And so April sees this and takes in what she's seeing, and she can't really process it. She doesn't really understand what this is. And she's looking at her friends, and they're so horrified. They've been yelling out about something being real, like, what is that? Oh my gosh. And she's kind of looking back and forth, and then she sees it. She sees there's something else inside of this jail cell. And when she sees it, she recoils in horror. She grabs her friends. They sprint out of the funeral home, and they call the authorities. When authorities arrived, they went right down into the basement and they looked inside of that jail cell, and quickly they determined that April and her friends had not been alone inside of this building like they had thought. It would turn out 6 days earlier, a local man who had nothing to do with April and her friends, totally separate, had gone to this funeral home to have a look around. Except he wasn't an urban explorer. He was not going in here to have a good time or take photos. He was going inside to steal scrap metal and try to sell it for a profit. And so he made his way inside the funeral home, he looked around, he didn't really find much, but eventually went down into the basement. And when he got down there, he turned, he looked out at that space down there, and he saw this jail cell, this metal jail cell that just kind of sat in the middle of the basement. Except what he would have seen is just the bars that sort of surrounded the outside of the cell, the actual cell itself. The metal box in the middle that was on the floor that April saw and her friend saw, that was not there. And the hole in the ceiling would not have been there. He would have just seen basically a lot of metal in the middle of the basement. So he's thinking, I've hit the jackpot. This is exactly what I've come here for, to take this metal and go sell it. And so this man, he goes into the jail cell, into this cage, and he quickly realizes the actual metal struts that made up the cage, even if they were super valuable, they were thick and difficult to cut through, and so realistically, they were going to be really hard to extricate and get out of this place. But when the man is actually inside of this jail cell, this cage, he sees there's actually some other metal that he hadn't seen when he first came down that might be far easier to extract. Basically, right in the middle of this cell were additional metal rods that were running from the ceiling down to the ground. They were far thinner and easier to move around. And he's thinking, I could actually cut these and get these out of here and turn a profit on them, and then come back at a later date with, more people or more powerful tools to cut the metal that sort of was the cage, the stuff that he had originally seen. And so, feeling pretty optimistic, the guy put his stuff down, his phone, his wallet, his other things off to the side, in the cage. And then he got out his bolt cutters and he cut the very first one of these thinner cables right in the middle of the cell. And as soon as he cut one of them, there was this loud rumbling sound he would have heard right above him. And then this big metal box came crashing down and pinned him to the ground. It would turn out what this man had walked inside of was not a jail cell in the basement of the funeral home. It was actually the inner workings of something known as a casket lift. Basically, the funeral home has to raise caskets from the basement where potentially they're stored up to the main floor to be used. And, they're pretty cumbersome, big things that need to get moved around. And so effectively, they have an elevator that brings them up. And so that big metal box that came crashing down on this guy was the actual lift itself that actually carried up the caskets. And the cord that he cut were actually the cords that supported that lift. And so as soon as he cut one of them, he was cutting the support to effectively the elevator car that was right above him that then fell and crushed him. However, he didn't die from getting crushed. He just got trapped. And as soon as he realized he was trapped and being kind of crushed to death here, he reached for his phone, but he realized his phone was just barely outside of his reach. He couldn't get to his phone. And nobody knew he was here. This was an illegal activity. He didn't broadcast where he was going. And so he's stuck. He can't call anyone, and no one knows he's here. And so for 6 days, that lift gradually crushed this man to death. And then finally, when April and her friends showed up and they went down in the basement, they didn't just see, this destroyed casket lift. They saw this dead man's body, and he was literally outstretched, still reaching for his phone.
Wow. Oh, what a way to die. That's why in one of those situations, man, you should always be with somebody else. Even if you're doing the urban exploring, you should always be with somebody else because you never know what could happen. You're walking through a dilapidated home, you fall through the floor, you break an ankle. In that fall, you lose your phone's in your hand, you lose the phone on the second floor, and you fall into the basement or whatever. You should always be with somebody else, even if it's something like that. Wow. Of course, I guess you got to do your crime by yourself, right? Wow. I keep just saying wow because I don't know what else to say. That sucks. Well, this is a short one. We'll be back with the final part. Wow. Well, anyways, until next time, have a good day, have a good night.